Great. It's so wonderful to be here. I kept my water near here. Forgive me, I'm having some allergies, so I might be making some frequent visits to the water bottle here. But it's such a pleasure to be here at the debut of our new 360 event. And I actually want to take this opportunity to really thank Media Mahima, because they've fully put all their energy into this event. You know, they've sponsored it. There's no registration fee. They're so committed to the health of our community. So I'd like to put our hands together for them for all the time they put into organizing this. Thank you very much. All right. So with that, let's get started. You've got my background already. You already had a great talk already preceding this by Swamiji and then Dr. Akhil, who's a colleague of mine. So you've gotten some great background into eating a healthier, balanced diet. I want to provide some of the background behind how you can identify your health risks, just giving you a little bit of knowledge behind that, and also share some real key clinical pearls from my wellness programs in my clinic that can sort of help you start taking steps towards getting your family healthier. So I know this is small print up here right now, but as Dr. Akhil alluded to in some of his slides as well, there's really two key things that I focus on in my medical practice, and those processes are inflammation, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, and a condition called insulin resistance. And I'm going to spend some extra time at the beginning of the talk making sure that you understand those concepts clearly, because in my clinic, every patient I see, I spend several minutes explaining these concepts to them, because then the lifestyle changes they make a lot of sense. Without knowledge, I can keep telling you eat healthier, lower this food, lower that food, but until you quantitatively understand what's happening in your body, you're not going to make the changes you need to make. So inflammation, if you look at it, it's at the center of almost every chronic health condition you can think of, from cancer to heart disease to Alzheimer's. On the right, I've got insulin resistance, and that's really the underlying root cause of diabetes, fatty liver, a lot of conditions. And although I put them in two separate boxes, there's a lot of overlap between both conditions. Insulin resistance can feed inflammation. Inflammation often is preceding insulin resistance. So one of the questions I heard earlier was about type 2 diabetes. There's multiple things that can cause type 2 diabetes, but often it is an early inflammatory process that can lead to that particular change. Okay, so Dr. Akhil had mentioned the term leaky gut. So just to give you an idea, in this diagram, what you can see is that the top row are external factors that can affect our intestinal system. So most of our immune system is actually housed inside our digestive tract. So at the top, if you can see, there's multiple factors that can cause that initial disruption of our gut lining. So those include things like micronutrient deficiencies, which you heard about. So if you're significant vitamin D deficient, microminerals that are key for lowering inflammation, improving metabolism, that's a major factor that can cause that early inflammatory change. They might be toxin exposures. Believe it or not, physical and emotional stress is a major cause of systemic inflammation. So those factors, you see that red arrow, they can literally cause damage to the lining of your intestinal wall. And then your intestinal wall is where a lot of your immune system is. That can trigger inflammation and then cause all the changes that we talked about in those initial two diagrams. Now, the process of insulin resistance, this is a signature diagram from my book. I use this with every patient in the clinic so they understand this process. So basically, think of your body as being kind of a parking lot, okay? And in the middle is the excess carbohydrates, because often this is a carbohydrate-driven process in many of our patients. So look at the car in the middle, and I tell people the three major parking lots in our body are the muscle at the top left, the liver, and then the fat. Okay? So in an ideal situation, when you consume carbohydrates, you want the carbohydrates to drive to your to your muscle parking lot. And the way it gets inside the muscle parking lot is by using the hormone insulin. So I tell all my patients insulin is the parking pass that gets the carbohydrate car through the door into the lot so your muscle can burn that for energy. When I say that the vast majority of South Asians, or the vast majority of really global population right now is developing insulin resistance, what I'm saying is your body is producing the parking pass, which is insulin, but the muscle is not adequately responding to the signal. So then what happens? It can't get inside the muscle, it goes to the liver, it forms triglycerides. That's why the majority of patients that I see in the clinic have a condition called high triglycerides. The liver takes in the extra starches and converts it to triglycerides. So that's one parking lot. So I call that one of the overflow parking lots because the muscle's already full. The other overflow parking lot are fat cells. So the car goes inside the fat cells, belly expands, and then that belly fat is what can raise inflammation. So when you look at belly fat, we'll talk about in a second, that can cause increased inflammation that actually makes this whole cycle worse. So that's really, I tell people, really insulin resistance is a carbohydrate traffic problem, okay? And that's a traffic problem we can solve with lifestyle changes. Now, aside from insulin resistance being linked to diabetes, we're finding a significant link between insulin resistance and brain function, to the point that now Alzheimer's disease is being called type 3 diabetes. We're seeing significant elevations in Alzheimer's disease, and some of that, a lot of that can be tied to this process. And the reason for that is when your body is resistant to insulin, and in a second I'm going to show you how you can identify that, your body overproduces insulin. So most of us are walking around with excess insulin levels, and that extra insulin can do a lot of different things. It can cause your body to store more fat, but guess what it does in the brain? In the brain, excess insulin blocks the breakdown or degradation of a substance called amyloid. Amyloid is a substance that accumulates in our brains and leads to Alzheimer's disease. So this connection has become so strong that now they're calling Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes, because people with type 2 diabetes or with insulin resistant are at a significantly higher risk. This one study showed that diabetics are 50% more likely to develop Alzheimer's than non-diabetics. So I think there's been a lot of, everyone's heard about heart disease, right? I feel like people have become desensitized to heart disease. I know I want this working for the rest of my life, because this is really what defines my productivity, my mental faculties, happiness, all these things. So we have to make sure we do everything we can to protect our brain. So really, this is a very significant issue. The other thing I want to bring up is cancer. In my practice now, and just talking to the community, many people are coming to our country and they are the first generation of breast cancer. No family members ever had cancer. We're seeing new onset cancer now because of our modern lifestyles. And guess what? Insulin resistance is one of the underlying causes. And the reason for that is because when your body's insulin resistant, our blood sugar levels go up. In blood sugar, glucose is the preferred fuel for cancer cells. Okay, just like humans, cancer cells like to eat sugar. So if we can fix the insulin resistant issue, we take away that major fuel source for cancer cells. The other thing too is in insulin resistance, we release a hormone called IGF-1. It stands for insulin-like growth factor, and that is actually an important hormone in our body. It helps with muscle growth development, but in excess levels, it can actually significantly feed tumor cells and cause tumor cell proliferation. If people are at risk for cancer, it can cause cancer to spread more aggressively. Okay, so that's the connection between insulin resistance and cancer. Now this image kind of tells you the life cycle of what's happening with insulin resistance, and this is what we see at every stage of life. So here you can see a pregnant woman here, and so a lot of what we see when I talk to a gynecologist, I do see some pregnant women in the clinic, but what often happens in our community is we see a lot of unhealthy pregnancies. Woman gets pregnant, right? Then all of a sudden mother-in-law flies in from India and starts feeding her all these ridiculous carbohydrates and sweets and things, right? We have a lot of myths about what you should be eating when you're pregnant. So then what ends up happening is, pregnant woman ends up gaining probably more weight than she needs to. We're seeing 40 to 50% gestational diabetes in South Asians. It's unbelievable. I mean, I talked to a gynecologist in Fremont, and she told me she's been tracking some of this. 40 to 50% of her Asian Indian patients have diabetes during pregnancy. So what does that do? When we have insulin resistance during pregnancy, the woman's body releases extra insulin. Remember I told you excess insulin is one of the issues? And that insulin already has an impact on the fetus. It causes the baby's body to develop a little bit more visceral fat around their little baby belly, okay? It also takes nutrients away from the muscles and other developing tissues, and that's why often you get low birth weight babies. So a lot of Indian babies are born low birth weight. Interestingly, when you look at Hispanics and other populations, when the mom's diabetic, the babies become very large. We call them macrosomia. They become very heavy, but a lot of Asian babies, Chinese and Indians, they're very underweight. They're very skinny. Okay? And how does the family react to a very skinny baby? They overfeed that baby, right? The whole family gets involved. They hire a nanny. We're going to get this baby's growth chart up as quickly as possible, okay? So my wife, unfortunately, was on a business trip. She would have loved to be here, but what she sees in her pediatric clinic is when kids are very small, the parents will look at the growth curve, right? Have you guys ever seen a growth curve, those charts that they give you in the pediatrician's office? They look at the growth curve and they say, oh my God, my kid's at 50%. And in their mind, I think they look at the growth curve like an academic curve. right? So they're like, my kid can't be 50th percent. I'm going to get them to 100% as soon as possible, right? So everybody gets on board and they shoot that 30th, 40th percentile to 80, 90 as fast as they can. Now, what that is doing is that is programming that baby's body to actually store a lot of visceral fat, okay? Because it seems like it's in a starvation stage. And that sets the template for diabetes and heart disease later in life. Really important, because this is a lot of our big parts of our culture. You know, we've got family coming, we've got nannies trying to overfeed kids, but this can set the template for disease later on. We see with teenagers, older kids are gaining more weight, developing more health issues. We'll talk about that in a second. Then that translates into adult disease, and that gets passed on by generations. Okay? There's another condition that's very intimately linked to insulin resistance. It's called polycystic ovarian syndrome. My dietitian, Prerna Uppal, who's going to speak after me, will talk about this. This is becoming incredibly common. So this is a condition in teenage girls and young women. And basically some of the symptoms that manifest in young girls are things like irregular periods, acne, facial and body hair, obesity, and eventually infertility. And I remember growing up as a teenage boy, I can recall a lot of the females that I knew, and just thinking back to them, I can almost guarantee that they actually had PCOS. And it was a sad thing for them because many of them got teased because they were overweight or they had facial hair, and boys would make jokes about them. And many of them didn't even know that they had PCOS. So I think for our community, for anybody, we need to really identify this condition and know more about this, because the manifestations later in life are pretty significant. Diabetes risk is 7 times greater, okay? Girls that have PCOS, increased heart disease risk. You know, globally, the stats are about 1 in 10 women. In South Asian women, it's about 1 in 5, okay? So it's pretty significant. The good news is it is reversible with lifestyle changes. So in my book, I document a case study. I've seen a lot of women come in with PCOS. I just saw a woman in the clinic a couple of weeks ago. She was diagnosed 5 years ago, and she had cysts all over her ovaries. She just gave birth to a baby, and on her repeat ultrasound, all the cysts completely disappeared. Okay, so these are things that the traditional medical system often say you have to take medications, it's indefinite, but with lifestyle changes, when you can cut out insulin resistance, you end up cutting out these health conditions too. So really, it's, you know, the whole family's responsibility to really get behind this, identify it, talk to your physicians, and then implement a lifestyle change that can stop it in its tracks. Gestational diabetes I talked about already. Let's just pass through this. So women in general, so you know, when I wrote the book, you know, I definitely have a chapter for women's health, but as I'm seeing more and more women in the clinic, we find that women's bodies are very complex compared to males. So a lot of times husbands and wives will go on the same diet, and it's an unfair world. The husbands will lose weight and the women are stuck, even though they're following the rules much more than the husband. But really what's happening is there's a lot of hormonal complexity to women's bodies. So just going low carb may not work. So, you know, hormonal compromise, including infertility, is something we talked about with PCOS. But when we see women, it really is an approach to regulating hormones through lifestyle changes. Stress hormones are critical. You can diet and exercise all you want, but especially for women, if they don't manage their stress, they will not lose an ounce. Often when they diet, it adds to their emotional stress, and they actually end up gaining more weight. Any women out there where that's happened, right? It's very frustrating. These women will come in and tell me, I've been following this diet, I'm doing everything right, I'm only eating 1,000, 1,200 calories, I'm not losing any weight or I'm gaining weight. And it's because we're actually increasing stress hormones in the body. You know, our women today are just so busy, right? I mean, many of them are working, you know, trying to raise a kid here in Silicon Valley. That's a full-time job with all the stressors, and you're a chauffeur, you're a housekeeper, you're doing everything. And this can burn out our hormones quite a bit and cause things like depression, anxiety, autoimmune conditions, you know, after menopause. So already we're seeing pretty significant health and heart disease risks in women, but after menopause, it accelerates even more. So those cholesterol levels match men's risk as well, too. So it's really important, because for a lot of our South Asian women, their doctor's visits are pediatric visits and often gynecologic visits, but they're not getting appropriate health care in terms of primary care. So women, you know, heart disease is a major issue. It's the #1 killer in women. Make sure you're getting cholesterol checked, your glucose checked. You should be monitored as aggressively as your spouse is for heart disease risk, especially given all these risks that we talked about. Okay, so my book has a dedicated chapter on things like PCOS, preventing gestational diabetes, and a focus chapter on section on weight loss in women. And I'm happy to talk to you guys afterwards if you have any questions. So we've been talking about insulin resistance. What are some ways that you can identify if your body has that glucose parking problem? So I put a list of some of these up here. Some of these I call my metabolic six-pack. But basically, if you looked at your cholesterol profile, I told you about the triglycerides. That's one of the numbers. So standard labs will use 150 as a cutoff. Some labs use 500 as a cutoff, which blows my mind. Most heart disease happens at 200s. But really, ideally, the triglyceride should be less than 100 in most people. The lower, the better. That's usually the target I go for. When we can drop the triglycerides down below 100, that's when that belly fat goes down very aggressively. The other risk is having a low level of HDL, which is the healthy cholesterol. So if your HDL is less than 40 in males or less than 50 in females, that's a sign that there's increased risk of insulin resistance. And triglycerides and HDL tend to be fairly inversely proportional. The other thing is the increased waist circumference, and there's various ways we can measure that. We can check a waist to hip ratio. So there's ways you can actually assess that visceral, we call it visceral fat. Increased blood sugar, so checking your fasting blood sugar is one way, or checking a test called the hemoglobin A1C, which diabetics are familiar with. But even in patients who are not diabetic, often doing an A1C can be helpful because it gives you your average sugar snapshot for the last 3 months. And then blood pressure also is another indicator. I think I skipped over the ratio, sorry. So the ratio is one number I really focus on in the clinic. That's the triglyceride to HDL ratio. Really remember that number because it's not reported on any lab reports. You take your triglycerides, you divide by HDL, and a ratio of greater than 3.0 indicates risk. The lower that ratio is, the better. That tells us that our body's metabolizing the fats and carbohydrates appropriately. So really keep that one in mind. That is the most abnormal number in many of my patients, my South Asian patients in particular. And the good news is, it's for me in the clinic, it's the easiest number to fix. Patients for 10 years have highly inflamed, elevated triglyceride HDL ratios. Within a few months, we can reverse that if we make the right changes. So it's very reversible. Don't blame it on your genes or your family. There are things you can do to really fix that problem. Okay? And I also want you to be aware of the fact that nowadays, this is a UCLA study, I always pop up in slides, and just read through this, but this is a study that they did in almost 140,000 folks coming into the emergency room with heart attacks. And what they actually found was 75% of these individuals had normal LDL cholesterol levels. Half of them had LDL, which is the bad cholesterol, of less than 100. Over half of them had HDLs that were low and triglycerides were 160. So what's going on? Why are there so many normal cholesterol people having heart attacks? I'll tell you why. The reason is because now in the traditional system, when you see a doctor and you've got high cholesterol, you're probably going to be put on a medication, either at that visit or in 3 months if you don't make the right dietary changes. And the cholesterol medications are amazing number changers. They can change your numbers within weeks. You can go from a cholesterol of 300 to 160 within 4 to 6 weeks. But unfortunately, it's a very small piece of the whole picture of inflammation. It only lowers a certain segment of heart disease risk, but most of the heart disease is still coming from the extravisceral fat. There are studies that show that after people go on cholesterol medications, often they have a 5 to 7 pound weight gain, because when they see their numbers go down, they're like, I'm going to eat more junk, right? I'm totally protected. But believe me, don't get that impression at all. But guess what? If you are on a cholesterol medication inappropriately, cholesterol medications like statins make insulin resistance worse. Let me repeat that. Cholesterol medications like statins can make insulin resistance worse. They're very important drugs in select people, but for my goal is how can I fix this problem without using any medications? If, God forbid, we have enough risk, or if I find a plaque in the arteries, then we'll think about using statins. But really keep that in mind, because I've seen blood sugars go up as a result of inappropriately being on cholesterol medications. I see it over and over in the clinic. Okay, so I have a whole dedicated chapter on cholesterol. Like we talked about, triglyceride to HDL ratios of less than 3.0 is one of our targets. You know, in some cases, we might check some advanced lipid cholesterol tests because a standard cholesterol test may not give us all the answers, and that can actually measure your particle sizes. So I talk a lot in detail about in the book, but in general, when your LDL particle size is small, so I call these small boats, our heart disease risk tends to go up. So smaller LDL cholesterol particles are more dangerous. And one way you can tell if you have small cholesterol boats without doing advanced testing is looking at your triglycerides. When your triglycerides are above 150, about a 70% chance that your particle size is small. If you're above 200, you don't need to get the advanced test. I can guarantee you've got that type B dangerous small LDL particle. So once we bring the triglycerides down, over time the LDL size will shift from that dangerous particle size upward. Okay? So now just to help quantify this a little bit better, this is not the actual person, this is just a stock photo, but this is a typical sort of a heart attack patient that I see in the clinic. So this is a guy, his name's Sam, he's a 32-year-old engineer who came to see me after his first heart attack 6 months ago. He's got a body mass index of 22, which by standard criteria would be considered a normal body mass index. He's got a normal blood pressure, he doesn't smoke, he exercises 3 days a week, and he's been told in the past that his lipids are not concerning, okay? But unfortunately, he had a heart attack and he came to see me. And unfortunately, 32 is becoming a very common age for people having heart attacks. So let's look at his cholesterol profile together now that you've got a little background on how to look at these numbers. So I'm not a fan of total cholesterol. This is one thing I talk about over and over. Total cholesterols are very misleading. This guy who had a heart attack had a total cholesterol of 190. What are most of you told is a cutoff for a good cholesterol? What's the number that people throw at you? Less than 200 usually. The majority of my patients that have a heart disease or have a heart attack are actually below 200. An average total cholesterol is about 180 for my heart attack patients. That tells you how useless that number is. Now, if you have a total cholesterol above 300, that's a different story. But look, his number is 190. Let's dig a bit deeper. His LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, was 108. And generally, a lot of labs use less than 130 or less than 100 as a cutoff. So for a traditional mainstream person that assesses diets, they might say that's a pretty good cholesterol. But now look at this, the HDL, 32, so very low. For males, we want it above 40, that's the healthy cholesterol. Triglycerides at 250. Now TC to HDL ratio, that's the total cholesterol to HDL ratio. I think I'm getting old, I'm having to squint my eyes, but hopefully you guys can read this okay. But this ratio definitely came back high. And remember the TG, the triglyceride to HDL ratio, here's where the money is. This is what really should have been identified. It should be less than 3. This is almost at 8. This ratio is what led to the inflammation, the disturbances that led to plaque formation over the years and led to a heart attack. And the reason his total cholesterol looks so falsely low is because, again, the HDL is low, and when you've got the small particle LDL, it drives your total number down. It's very misleading. So make sure you pay attention to those ratios, really critical to assessing heart disease risk. So let's talk about body size. I mentioned to you the belly fat. I just want to highlight this for a second because the belly fat is what is, when you look at fat in my arms and legs, that does not release many toxic chemicals, but it's the fat in our belly that can release a lot of inflammatory substances that can lead to diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and even Alzheimer's disease risk. And the way I like to explain our fat in our body, because this varies depending on your ethnic background, is think of a jelly donut. Hopefully this is not going to make you feel too hungry, but basically let's think of this analogy. Let's think of our body fat, okay? There's 2 types of body fat. There's our outer subcutaneous body fat, which is underneath our skin. So that's the yellow crust of the donut. And then the inside middle part is the red inflammatory jelly. This is the visceral fat that's very dangerous, okay? Now here's where ethnicity comes into play. So for most of us, that external fat is what we can see on the outside. It's still dangerous to our health because it contributes to body weight, but it does not cause as much inflammation. Now if you can see, I don't know if you can read this, but these are 3 major ethnic groups. We've got Caucasian, African Americans, and Asians. So these are Chinese and Indians. And in Caucasians, they have some of the jelly, and you've got a fair amount of outer crust here. African Americans, interestingly, relatively speaking, they don't have as much of the dangerous jelly, but they have a lot more of the outer visible subcutaneous fat. But look at Asians. Asians have a lot more of that hidden visceral fat, that jelly. That's why so many of my 30-year-old Indian heart attack patients are skinny. They come in and their family's trying to overfeed them. They're like, you need to eat more rotis, whatever. But they're socking away all this extra visceral fat inside their liver, into their digestive organs. But look at the very thin rim of outer fat. That fat's not very visible. Maybe it's a slight bulge around the belly. But this is why we have different now body mass index criterion cutoffs for Asians versus other populations. So the cutoff is 23, whereas for Caucasians the cutoff is 25. And this is why it's especially important to measure those biometric numbers like triglycerides, to measure abdominal fat. And in some cases, getting body fat testing is not a bad idea, but usually doing those abdominal waist circumferences and other tests can give us a clue in terms of whether there's extra amounts of visceral fat. Okay, so that's subcutaneous, and that's the visceral jelly deep inside. So one of the simplistic ways I've outlined this in my book is I use this analogy called the carbs mnemonic. So this is just a very rough way for you to think about, because if you have insulin resistance, we know we have to make some changes in the carbohydrates. So the mnemonic here, or the acronym that I use, C is for chapatis or flatbreads, which are part of, and I'm not saying that we're eliminating these. These are just things we have to be aware of so we're not consuming too many of these. So basically, chapatis or flatbreads, aloo or potatoes. Now, I agree with Dr. Akhil. I think potatoes can be a very healthy part of the diet. They feed the right gut health bacteria. But if you've got metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and you're consuming a lot of carbohydrates, we need to reverse that process first before we reintroduce excess amounts of these other types of starches. But aloo or potatoes is the other part. R is rice, which we can talk about. B is beans and lentils. Again, we're going to include these in healthy ways, but if we have this in excess, so if we're already insulin resistant and we're eating lots of dal, lots of lentils, lots of potato-based curries, it is going to cause blood sugar results to go up. And then the last thing is obviously sugar. So typically I tell people you want to really focus on how can we modify the diet to lower these in excess and include more nutrient-dense vegetables and other foods that can lower inflammation and insulin resistance. Now this is a typical case study for my book that I tell people. So typically if we were to measure what we call the net carbs, which is your grams of carb minus the fiber, in most of my patients we want to keep that less than 100 to 150 grams. The minute we start consuming more than 150 to 200 grams, unless you're very physically active, that's the level which causes more fat storage and insulin resistance. So let's look at this woman's typical meal. A typical meal, and again, this is per day. Okay, this is per day. So this woman right here in one meal, 1 roti land bran chapati, 1 cup cooked lentils, a cup of cooked aloo sabji or potato-based curry, that's 94 grams. That's pretty much what I eat on an average day, right? So imagine, multiply that by 3, add in the snacks that she has with her tea in the afternoon and whatever other eating we're doing, we're 400 to 500 grams, which is the average number I calculate in my clinic. My average patients, 400 to 500 plus. My Chinese patients often 500 to 600 grams of carbohydrate per day. And I tell them, they're like, well, that's how my ancestors ate. Why are you trying to take? I'm like, your ancestors were walking way more steps, right? They weren't sitting in front of a computer. You're eating the amount of carbohydrates that Michael Phelps should be training with before the Olympics. And you're sitting in front of a computer all day. Because if your muscles are that active, they will burn all of this for energy. So that's why when we talk about low carb, I don't actually believe in low carb, believe it or not. I believe that your carbohydrates have to be proportional to your body composition and your activity levels. Many of my patients that have succeeded, now they're training for half marathons, they're running triathlons, they're training like crazy. We can double, triple their net carbohydrate intake, and they have no elevations in their triglycerides at all. So that's one more incentive for making this change. Your body will be more energetic, you'll be more physically active, you add some physical exercise in, and now you can be a little bit more liberal with your diet, making sure you're eating the right types of plant-based carbohydrates that Dr. Akhil talked about. Okay, so one approach I tell people about is what I call carb copycats. I've been talking about carb copycats for many years, but this is really gratifying because now if you're too busy to make your own cauliflower rice, you can go to Trader Joe's. They have in the frozen section. They've got pre-riced cauliflower and broccoli in the vegetable section. So stir fry that with some ghee and turmeric, add your Indian spices to it. This is one of the best substitutions you can make for rice. Other types of ways to use vegetables to become the center of your plate. So I tell people, make vegetables your starches. That single change will allow you to burn more belly fat than doing 1,000 sit-ups a day, honestly, because insulin levels are going to go down when you start substituting extra grains with natural plant-based vegetables, right? Now with exercises, I know a lot of us get very busy. We may not be comfortable going to a gym, but I remind people, can we incorporate some of our ancestral postures, right? So this is a typical Asian squat, right? How many of you can do this now? Can you put your feet on the ground? And you can do it with your butt touching the ground? Okay, you have to demonstrate for me. That's a classic Asian squat, is when your buttocks can actually touch the ground while your heel's on the ground. But this is how we used to eat. This is how we'd read the paper. We had amazing hip mobility, right? We're able to use all those muscles in the quads. And when those muscles are stronger, they burn more starches throughout the day. So I tell people we need to incorporate some of our natural postures, which yoga introduces as well, but reconnecting with that is key. For my techies out there, these are some apps that I use to really get them engaged. So they're made by a company called Runtastic. So when I see patients in the clinic who have never squatted before, often I'll tell them download these apps. And the nice thing is you can use your phone with these. And when you download the app for squats, as you're doing the squats, it'll count how many squats you're doing. It's using the accelerometer in your phone. So many will start off only being able to do 20 squats. And then by the time they see me in 3 months, they're doing this 2 or 3 times a week. They're doing 100 to 150 squats. And then magically, their triglycerides are dropping. Their body's insulin resistance is getting better. So making our body stronger is going to help do this. Alto and Falter are now experts, right? You guys do squats on the show every time? Right, we talk about this a lot, but Alto is. And then we've got the push-up app on there, but learning to do these simple body weight exercises can make a significant difference. Okay? Now I know all of us are familiar with trackers. They're everywhere now. A couple of tips on trackers is number one, I want people to be aware of what their midday goal is, because many people use these trackers and they may get all their steps in the morning or maybe in the evening, but we want to keep physical activity regular throughout the day. The reason for that is when we sit for more than 20 to 30 minutes at a time, our body generates more fat-storing hormones. We're not burning as much sugar. So prolonged sitting actually makes blood glucose go up. So many of my patients that go to the gym 3 to 4 times a week, if they're still sitting most of the day, their glycemic control, their glucose control is still not optimal. So the newer generation watches now will track hourly steps, so I love that feature. You can set a buzzer on there if you're using an Apple Watch, or if you've got an older generation one, which I actually have, I know that roughly by 1 p.m. I want to aim for 4,000 to 5,000 steps. That assures me that at least the first half of the day I got enough steps, and then I try to get the remainder during the second half of the day. Okay? Now, interval training, another really powerful thing to do. So this is for folks that can't fit in exercise on various days. What interval training basically means is pick an exercise that you can do comfortably without injuring yourself and alternate it doing fast, slow. So for example, if you're on an exercise bike, a Tabata interval basically means you go 20 seconds as fast as you can, and then you stop or go slow for 10 seconds. Go 20 seconds as fast as you can, and then go slow for 10 seconds. Do that 8 times. That's 4 minutes. 4 minutes of doing interval training is equivalent to about doing 20 minutes continuous at a moderate level on a bike. So that's a major time-saving difference. So whatever activities you do, try to think of that in your head. How do I do this in an interval way? If you go for walks in the evening, can I go fast for 30 seconds and then slow down for 15 seconds? Metabolically, it's significant. They've shown, so in the early days with these studies, we used to think that you have to do this super intense to get all the benefits, but they've done studies even in seniors to show seniors who can't run, if they just walk fast and walk slow, just alternate their heart rate a little bit, their body produces, it burns more fat. Our body produces more growth hormone, which allows us to hold on to more muscle tissue and to burn more fat. It's much more time efficient. But another key thing I want to make you aware of is even though it can cut down your total workout time, you still want to make sure you're getting enough physical activity with the time you save. There's a lot of news headlines saying, get fit in 10 minutes a day. You know, you see this, the New York Times came up with a few articles. And the problem is people that used to spend an hour in a gym think they can do a 15-minute HIIT workout and then go back and sit on their computer. But what I tell them is use this to maybe streamline your aerobic workout, but then spend the other part of your 1 hour doing some weight training, some leg training, doing some yoga, some meditation, some walking. Don't just use it as an excuse to get back into sitting, because that's not going to help overall health. Okay? So overcoming insulin resistance, we want to fix this metabolic traffic problem. So one of the key strategies we talked about is we've got to lower the amount of net carbohydrate traffic so we're not overwhelming the muscles. The other things we have to think about is how do we get more daily steps, more physical activity? We need to reduce sitting time. How do we add more strength? So one tip is anytime you guys go to the gym, even if it's once or twice a week, the first thing you want to do is warm up for 5 or 10 minutes and then hit your legs immediately. Okay, this is the most neglected muscle in the body. Now, most of my patients like to do the dumbbells or the more easy small muscle groups, but these muscle parking lots are size dependent. If your legs get stronger, they can hold more chapatis than your biceps can. Okay, they can hold more flatbreads than your biceps or your chest, right? So basically, and that is the early part of the workout is when you psychologically have the most motivation. And legs take motivation when you're doing squats or pushing heavy amounts of weight. So you want to do that at the beginning. Okay, so I usually say warm up for 5 minutes to get the muscles warm, and then do the leg workout, then finish off with whatever, and then go on the elliptical after that. But if you do all your aerobic cardio stuff and then you try to do the legs, you're not going to want to do it, and you're not going to do it sufficiently enough to actually stimulate and trigger more growth. Okay, so more strength is key. We have to manage stress and sleep. This whole traffic diagram, especially for women and even in men, when we're under chronic stress and sleep deprivation, the body will not release fat adequately because cortisol levels are so high. I tell people cortisol puts a lock and key around our fat cells, and you can diet and run and do burpees and boot camps, it will never release it. For many of our women, until they incorporate meditation, yoga, and stress reduction, and actually sometimes even lower the intensity of their exercise, they will not lose an ounce of fat. I don't know how I can make this point more emphatically, but I've been seeing this year after year after year. Okay? And then replenishing the micronutrients, Dr. Akhil talked about that, and Prerna is going to join us and talk about this too. Also, inflammation is something I alluded to. Keep in mind that one of our talks in the afternoon, Dr. Patrick is going to be talking about low back pain. And I've done a couple of blog posts and some radio shows on back pain, but that can be a significant trigger for inflammation because of our posture. So be sure to check out his booth, but there's an independent link between low back pain and heart disease because people under chronic pain actually have more inflammation. And if they're eating an improper diet on top of that, they're getting into trouble with that too, okay? And then Bindu Garapati is here. She's going to talk about stress and resilience, so please hang out for a talk because again, if we don't fix the stress issues here, the rest of this may not be necessarily very effective. Okay? So another example I just want to bring up, to eat or not eat before exercise. You know, we talk about this practice of intermittent fasting, but this is a study that literally came up and actually showed that in this cohort of people that actually did not eat before exercise, what they showed was genetically all the genes and proteins that upregulate a process called lipolysis. That's a fancy word for fat burning. All of those were upregulated, okay? So typically we're told eat a healthy breakfast before you exercise, but for many of us, we have enough energy from the carbohydrates that we ate the day before to fuel an adequate exercise session. So one quick tip I tell a lot of my engineers and high-tech workers is when you wake up in the morning, have your coffee or tea, get to Oracle, get to whatever company early, walk for 15, 20 minutes. Even if you don't break a sweat, when you do any physical activity in a fasted state, you're stimulating some degree of fat burning. But the minute you put those toast and biscuits and whatever, oatmeal, etc., into your body, and now you try to exercise, you've actually inhibited some of that. Now, this doesn't work for everyone. Some people, they do feel like they need to get a little bit of a healthy breakfast in, and then that gives them the energy. But keep in mind that for a lot of people, fat burning happens very adequately when they've done it in a fasted state, the exercise. Okay? Now, let's finish off with a couple of things about a topic called epigenetics. So I tell people, again, I might have encouraged this a little bit before when I showed the life cycle diagram, but again, the seeds for insulin resistance and inflammation are planted very early in life. I really want to make that key point to you. And the way we want to understand this is there's a whole field now called epigenetics. And what epigenetics basically means is there are environmental factors, epi, that can affect our genetic expression. In the old days, we used to think that if you inherited the gene for diabetes, you're doomed, right? I see this in my patients all the time. Mom, dad have diabetes, siblings have diabetes. Why should I even try? I'm just going to eat whatever I want because I'm going to become diabetic anyway, right? But modern science is much more hopeful. So think of this. I tell people, think of your human genome as your human gene phone. So pretend you inherited this phone from your family. And inside it, encrypted basically, is all of the genetic material, which are basically apps, okay? So maybe from your family, you inherited the app for type 2 diabetes. Maybe your parents passed on an app for cancer, obesity, or Alzheimer's disease, okay? So based on their behaviors, they might have passed on those apps into your gene pool. The good news is we can influence whether those apps are turned on or off. So if we're eating the right foods, we can turn off the diabetes apps. If we correct the micronutrient deficiencies, maybe we can turn off the obesity app, right? So on and so on. Inactivity, stress, sleep deprivation, toxin exposures. Because really what's happening in a lot of our families is, yes, they've downloaded the apps for diabetes, but they've also inherited the cultural practices. They're cooking the same foods that their parents cook, which are maybe high in starches or sugars and sweets. And once we can reverse some of those patterns, we can be the one family member that does not turn on their diabetes, heart disease, their PCOS app. That's really our goal here. Okay? And now I want to say that there's tremendous evidence too that shows that the male lifestyle has a significant impact on what happens within that gene pool. Because I showed you gestational diabetes and PCOS, and often the blame goes to mom. Oh, maybe mom was not healthy during pregnancy, and that's why my son's now overweight and diabetic. But guess what? Male lifestyle habits, diet, and exercise have a significant impact on what genes actually get turned on. So if your grandfather or your father was very unhealthy, if your mom went through a lot of high stress, that's going to increase the expression of those disease apps in your body. And it goes back to even grandparents. So often if you look back, they've done studies where they looked at if grandmother or mother went through a chronic period of, let's say, financial depression or chronic disease, that will influence which apps are going to get turned on in both the children and the grandchildren. Okay? And this I'm putting up here because I'm very thankful for the fact that my dad, so my father, he was born in Calcutta, India. I'm Bengali, and he went to medical school in Calcutta. This is not my father, by the way. So basically what I'm thankful for is he didn't just bury his head in the books. In Calcutta, in a small area of Calcutta, he used to see this guy, his name's Manotosh Rai, who used to train him 3 days a week. And Manotosh Rai is the first Indian Mr. Universe in the amateur division in 1951. And he also trained a gentleman called Bikram Chaudhary, who's the founder of Bikram Yoga. So I'm very thankful that my dad, and actually my dad's dad, was also very physically fit. So they didn't know about epigenetics then, but they happened to lead a lifestyle that gave me the best chance. Okay, they downloaded the apps of good health in my body, and then by me exercising and eating the right foods, I was able to turn that app on. Now, all of us don't have that history. Maybe your dad wasn't very physically active and he was overweight. So maybe you've inherited that app. But the good news is, again, through lifestyle changes, we might be able to turn that app off. We're not going to maximize the effects of that app. So really, this is motivation for all of us because really your behaviors, if you're thinking of having kids, your behaviors, male and female, are going to influence your genetic template. Maybe you finished having kids, but then your behaviors themselves, if you're not active, your kids are not going to pick up on those cues, and then their risk, your grandchild's risk is going to be higher because they're not following a lot of the principles that we talked about. Okay? So don't underestimate the power of proper lifestyle changes. This is a software engineer. I just want to give you an idea of how powerful lifestyle is. So this is a gentleman that's been he's 52 years old. He works at a high-tech company. He has been pre-diabetic since 2003. In 2014, he basically progressed to full-blown diabetes. So you can see that A1C number, it was in the low 6s, and then all of a sudden in June 2014, he went up to 7.5, okay? And then now look at this, from June 2014, and also you can see his triglycerides. They went up gradually, they're at the 190 level right here. But now look what happened from June to September, okay? Just within 3 months, we just implemented simple lifestyle changes. After years of prediabetes, okay, he inherited that diabetes app from his parents and even his grandparents. What did he do? He dropped his A1C to 5.4. He completely turned off his diabetes app. His triglycerides dropped to 104. Unfortunately, I don't have the HDL here, but his healthy cholesterol went up as well too. So and again, this is a bit of an extreme example. In many patients, it might take 6 months, 9 months, or a year, but in 3 months, he turned all of that off. If we didn't do this for him, his doctor at the corporate on-site clinic would have put him on diabetes medications. Maybe that would have progressed to insulin within a couple of years, but really lifestyle habits is what changed his life. Okay? So this is another thing I put up here. I do a separate talk with my wife who's a pediatrician because I think the amount of stress we put on ourselves and our kids nowadays is becoming out of control. So I give a talk called Is Your Child a Startup? Right? Because sometimes the way we treat our kids, we back them with finances and resources. We have all these sky-high expectations and we don't allow them to be kids anymore. And this is why kids are dealing with emotional devastation. They're developing adult health conditions. We have to make sure we're leading balanced lifestyles for our kids. That triglyceride to HDL ratio that I talked about is actually a predictor of heart disease, PCOS, and cancer later in life. It is out of control. When I talked to my wife, who used to see kids in Fremont, she said almost every kid was coming in, at least by age 8 or 9, with high triglycerides and low HDL. And she never learned about that in medical training because kids were not developing cholesterol issues. And now routinely we're seeing kids, by the time they hit their teens or they enter college, triglycerides through the roof. HDLs are dropping down, visceral fat, fatty liver in 30 to 40%, actually 40% of Asian kids in some studies have shown that they have fatty liver. Their livers are getting tons of carbohydrates in it. And they seem very subtle, but they're coming in the form of juice boxes, right? Or really quick processed snacks, or tons of flatbreads and lots of carbohydrates. And they're spending more time on their screen, right? They're bathing in screen light instead of sunlight, and they're not being physically active at all. So we're seeing all these issues. And really, the pediatric guidelines now are saying that if there is a family, first-degree family member with high cholesterol, it's a good idea to get a baseline cholesterol done. We can at least identify this early. Okay? And this is a typical schedule for burnout. This is what I show when we do our pediatric talks. but this might sound familiar. So this is a history that my wife had taken, but basically this is a kid who'd wake up at 6:30 in the morning early for sports practice, hardly had any breakfast from that. Then from 8 to 3 p.m., we don't realize that our kids are busy in school. Like, their minds are very active. That's already a very fatiguing event. Many of them are eating minimal or maybe an empty lunch. They come back from school. They're filled with academic enrichment activities, maybe sports. There's no chill relaxation time for them to bring down those school stress levels at all. Then there's dinner time chaos. Sometimes we're not even eating a family dinner because you're rushing to math enrichment, basketball, soccer practice. You pick up fast food on the way. So now we're eating an inflammatory meal for the family. And then after that, we've got all this homework, extra academic work, music practice, late or inconsistent bedtimes. Our South Asians go to bed later than any other ethnic group we've seen. 10, 11 p.m. is routine. And then weekends, the cycle often continues with all these other extracurricular activities. Does this resemble anybody's life right now? Right? It gets pretty overwhelming. And it's become the new norm, especially in Silicon Valley. But I want to tell you, it's not normal. And adults and kids are all suffering. We've got to create some spaces here and really allow people to decompress. Okay, so I've got a whole chapter on children's health. My wife wrote that, but it's a lot of the common things that we see in our South Asian kids in particular. How do we instill more balance into a busy life? One thing people ask me is, so what are we supposed to do with food? You know, do we eat 2 different types of diets? This is a simple template I put up just to give you an idea. So I know a lot of us might be eating very diverse meals. So this is what I tell people. Let's say it's pasta night. Okay, if we like to eat pasta, if we have an at-risk family member, maybe dad's got prediabetes or high triglycerides, then maybe he can do the substitution starches, the spaghetti squash, the zucchini noodles. If you've got an active child like my kids that play basketball all the time, they can do maybe some whole wheat pasta, right? So we're just changing out the starches, but then the sauce can be the same fresh tomato-based sauce. If you're non-veg, it can be a good quality meat. You have the salad, fresh sauce, you know, the fruit. That stays stable for the entire family, okay? For Indian nights, can the at-risk family member do more cauliflower rice? Maybe the coconut flour chapatis. Maybe the healthy family member can afford to do the rice and quinoa, but we have the same vegetable curry, the same meats, the same curry, the same salad. Mexican nights, maybe if we're going to do the at-risk family member at home, I'll do a burrito bowl or a lettuce-wrapped taco. My kids can do with tortillas, but we're going to have that same nutrient-dense guacamole, maybe some cheese, maybe some sour cream, lots of fresh vegetables. And same for Asian night. You know, can we do some noodle substitutions? Again, healthy member can probably do more starches, and then the substance is the same. So this is how we do it. And then, you know, you tailor it based on each person's risk, but the substance, the core of the meal stays consistent, and this is how you can make it work for individual family members. Okay? And then this is a picture of my grandmother who I featured in the book. And really the main point I wanted to make is I know when people get very quantitative, now there's a whole movement towards quantifying yourself. You might be measuring your net carbs. But the good news is once you get past that stage, when I see my patients after they've met their goals, I tell them, you know what, just turn off your apps and follow that native intuition. Now for me, I don't measure net carbs anymore. There are days I know, because I did a weight training workout yesterday, I naturally know that I need to eat more protein. Okay, if I did an endurance hike, if you went up and did like a 3-4 mile hike, I'm not going to count carbs after that, okay? When your muscles are active, when your muscles are exhausted, if you eat starches after that, the starches are going to go towards your muscle, not towards your fat cells. And that's why in lectures I tell people, you need to squat for your rice, okay? Your body, your muscles need to earn those carbohydrates. If there's a day where you're not physically active, okay, more vegetables, more proteins. I got to be a little bit more careful with my starch intake. So try to follow those signals, because my grandmother, she didn't have access to the internet. She wasn't wearing a Fitbit, but she knew how to do these things intuitively. So as we do that, then we can sort of disconnect from all the data overload and start following our native practices. And then when we fall off, which will inevitably happen, then you can use the apps, the tools, and the resources to help you get back on track. Okay, so a couple of quick resources. Prerna's going to talk to you after me, but we are doing our first retreat this summer, and this is a retreat we're going to do for 3 days in beautiful Scotts Valley. We are going to immerse people with information, apps, technology, and active practices of how to put all this clinical experience to work in the clinic. So that's one thing here. So you can go to this site. Also at the desk, we have the registration site there. We've got limited space. We'd love to see you at that event. If you don't know about my blog, join the blog because I've got a lot of information on there. I'm also launching some online programs. We've also got some links to some foods that are compatible with our lifestyle advice. This is a very popular ebook that a lot of people download for free. See so many people complaining about fatigue and energy. So if you go to my blog and just put your email address in there, you'll get a free 50-page ebook. It talks more about gut health, sleep, stress, and all that stuff. That's a great free resource you can take advantage of. So a lot of information for you guys. Pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Sinha.
Thank you.
Oh my God, type 3 diabetes? It was like, whoa, what was that again? Okay, so I guess we're going to open up the floor for questions.
Sure.
So go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Sinha.
Thank you.
That talk was very nice.
Thank you.
And I've already read your book and incorporated some of them already.
Thank you.
But a couple of questions. What are the top 3 things that you can do to lower the triglycerides without really taking any medication?
Perfect. Okay. So top 3 things. So triglycerides, most common issue. Showed you most of it's coming from the liver, right? So top 3 things. The first thing is to really, like we talked about, at every meal, if we can focus on lowering that net carbohydrate intake, the triglycerides will go down. Start with breakfast. Okay. For many of my patients, if we can fix breakfast, so if your diet allows eggs, do eggs instead of oatmeal, believe it or not. That's one of the easiest. I know it's the opposite of everything we've been told in the past, right? But if you did omelets or eggs, or if you don't eat eggs, do full fat, Greek yogurt or something with some nuts and berries. When we can fix a breakfast or incorporate some intermittent fasting a few times a week, we see triglycerides go down. See if you can do the same for lunch. If people do well for breakfast and lunch, they can have a typical South Asian meal, for dinner, and their triglycerides still stay well. But I do tell people to finish their dinners earlier. Try to finish dinner by 7:30 latest. More and more studies are showing that when we eat after 8, 9 p.m., all the metabolic hormones go haywire. It's actually linked to cancer risk now, we're finding, because our body's not able to metabolize the extra sugars and fats after that. So that'd be a simple way. Then the second is physical activity. And then the third would be replenishing any micronutrient deficiencies like vitamin D. But if you do one and get some increase in physical activity, triglycerides are guaranteed to go down. Thank you for asking. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so doctor, I have 2 questions. One, is yoga sun salutations, couple of rounds of sun salutations and some simple poses, not inversion poses, which is shoulder stand, is complete exercise that I will need if I add elliptical for 10-15 minutes a day? And then second question is it better to do walk after dinner? I'm a diabetic patient, they advise to walk 1 hour after the dinner, or is that before the dinner?
Great questions, okay? So the first thing is I'm a huge fan of sun salutations, so if you guys need to learn how to do it, do the workshop out there. There are great exercise for mobility, for lowering inflammation in the body, for reducing stress, but I'm much more aggressive about getting that strength up. So for that, we need to do at least 1 to 2 sessions of some form of weight training to get the new muscles to really regenerate and grow. So that has to be a type of exercise. So for example, when I did my leg workout yesterday, I actually did use a machine, but I do it usually 1 set to a level where I can't move the weight anymore. So your legs have to be completely exhausted, So that's a type of exercise you have to do if you really want to get the benefits of strength improvement. One resource, if you looked up slow weight training, that's one way that you can do that, but that's got to be key. So I'd say that yes, doing the Surya Namaskar, great part of it, but I wouldn't say that that's a replacement for doing more intensive resistance training. We still want to make sure we incorporate that. The second thing is absolutely walking can reduce the glycemic spikes after. So I talked about some of the benefits of doing exercise before, because we can drive carbohydrates towards muscle, but definitely after, like if you have your lunch at work, if you did some walking after that, you're going to reduce the glucose and insulin response by up to 30%. So evening walks after dinner or post-lunchtime walks are very beneficial too. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay.
Oh, here you go.
Yeah.
If the ratio of total cholesterol and HDL level is lower, is total cholesterol above 200 is okay, or how do you determine the healthy fats versus?
So you're saying if the total cholesterol to HDL ratio is normal,
less than 2.
if it's within range, then where should the total cholesterol number be? Is that what you're asking?
Mm-hmm.
So if your total cholesterol to HDL ratio is normal, same with the triglyceride to HDL ratio, the total cholesterol really becomes irrelevant. You know, in some people who inherited a very high LDL, so some people have congenital LDL 200, 250 plus, then that is going to drive the total cholesterol up, and that's a separate issue. But I tend to, the epicenter of really looking at the lipids is looking at the triglyceride HDL and to some extent the TC, total cholesterol HDL ratio, and then separately looking at the LDL. But I don't really get worried about LDLs unless they're really hitting the 160 plus, 200 plus range. And it really depends on context, what other family history there is. So if we're getting to that level, probably talking to your doctor, looking at those factors is key. But to give you an example, when patients reverse insulin resistance, their total cholesterol often will go up because now their HDL has gone up, their LDL is shifted to the healthier pattern, which will raise the total cholesterol. So that's why in most people, total cholesterol can be very misleading. The ratios are really the focus. Great.
Next question.
Hey, Dr. Sinha. I'm a big fan of yours. I have a book, and I do follow your book.
Great, thank you.
So I started the squats like maybe 2 years back.
Yeah.
And one bad thing is I'm on statins. And so even though I do my squats, I do have some body pain, and I thought it will go away with the period of time.
Yeah.
But I still do have a little bit of pain in my calves.
Sure.
So, and also my blood sugar, I think it should have gone down, but it's been, the A1C is been going up. So do you think the statins are impacting the blood sugar as well as the body pain?
So a couple things. So first thing I want to say, so statins, again, in some people are an absolutely indicated drug. The first thing I would do is look over your numbers in the way that I talked about. And if we make the right lifestyle changes, one of our goals is can we reduce or eliminate the statin? Now, if you're someone, like for example, some of our patients that get a heart scan, they have plaque already, they've been diagnosed with heart disease, they need to stay on the statin. But first is, do we need to be on the statin? The second thing is it contributing to those aches and pains? It sounds like after you started the statin, you started developing those aches and pains, you saw that correlation, correct? So yeah, and that can commonly happen. So some of the things that can help alleviate that is number one, we do sometimes recommending supplementing with an enzyme called coenzyme Q10. That can be helpful. Some studies point towards significant vitamin D deficiency, actually increasing inflammation and pain in the muscles. So if that's the case, Dr. Akhil talked about some natural lifestyle ways you can do that. But in many of our South Asian patients, they also need to take in some supplementation to help alleviate the vitamin D. And then see how you do with that. Now, having said that, if you're still having inflammation pain, sometimes we switch to different lines of statins, might have less of that impact. So you can try some of those strategies and see if that helps you. Yeah.
Quick question. So I've been I don't really remember the numbers, and the doctor said it should be that I think its total cholesterol should be less than equal to 125. Mine was way below, like it was 80, and I was so happy. And the doctor said, no, you should not be happy about it. You might get Alzheimer disease.
Yes.
And before giving I was like, I was really, after my pregnancy, I became really overweight, and then I started exercising. Like for almost 1 year, I've been running and doing yoga, and I kind of reduced my weight a lot, like almost 30-40 pounds.
Wow,
and,
good job.
And then for the last 1 year, I'm doing last year I was actually fit, and then I started fasting. Like I just tried fasting, and now I continue fasting once in a week. And my mom is really alarmed by it, but still I'm able to do it, like morning to night. The next day morning 6 o'clock is the time I would eat. And only water, and it could, so the question is, so is this okay? So now because of that I've gone down in cholesterol, or will this cause Alzheimer's disease, or is fasting okay?
Okay, so I'm going to make some broad points based on this because this really depends on each individual. But yes, there are some cases where cholesterol levels that are too low can be a little bit concerning. You know, and again, cholesterol, there's a lot of genetic variability. So I tell people don't fixate with the numbers. If your LDL is in this so-called low range, but you feel great, you're not having signs of inflammation in your body, your energy levels are good, I wouldn't obsess about the LDL or the cholesterol being too low. The second part of it is a question about fasting, and I blog a lot about fasting. I did a dedicated blog. Akhil has information about fasting. But the main thing I want to say about fasting is when people are eating a nutrient-dense diet and they're managing their stress or getting adequate sleep, then fasting can be something that can enhance those lifestyle habits. But many of my patients, it's interesting, some of my workaholic patients tell me, hey, I'm skipping breakfast and lunch and I just eat dinner, so I'm fasting already, but they're eating garbage, right? And they're not sleeping well. So then all of a sudden fasting becomes an inflammatory insult. You know, it's like exercise. I tell people, if you don't have core strength and you don't have balance, you can injure yourself by doing squats. So all of a sudden squatting becomes unhealthy. Fasting is the exact same way. So I just say that because some people are fasting and then that can burn out their adrenals, their hormonal, their hormonal balance, thyroid. They can get worse with fasting. You have to make sure that you're having an adequate foundation. Then when you finish a prolonged fast, make sure you're eating a very nutrient-dense diet after that. If we're still eating the same nutrient-deficient foods after a fast, then that's going to be a chronic nutrient-deficient state. So, okay? A bit of a big answer. I know there's some more detail, but we can talk more afterwards too. So, yeah.
First of all, thank you for this program. It's a wonderful program. I had a quick question. What is your take on over-the-counter multivitamins for general health?
Okay, so multivitamins for general health. I know there was a question earlier too. So in general, when you look at most of the studies and trials that have been done on multivitamins, they've shown absolutely no impact, negative or positive, on health. And many of the reasons are what Dr. Akhil talked about, because no nutrient or supplement is going to be as bioavailable as getting it from natural, whole, dense foods. So the only disclaimers I'd say is people that has significant kidney failure, digestive conditions where they absolutely can't absorb anything, a multivitamin might be useful. I personally do not take multivitamins. If people have significant dietary deficiencies that have been diagnosed, then vitamins make sense. But otherwise, to me, it's a waste of money taking multivitamins for most people. Kids, different issues. I'd have my wife address that. Some kids might need multivitamins during certain stages, specifically, but in general, multivitamins don't have much value. So elderly, so again, it depends on the situation. If elderly people are eating a balanced diet, there may not be a need for multivitamins necessarily, but if they've been diagnosed with some sort of nutrient deficiency that we're concerned about, then they probably need to target whatever vitamin they're deficient in. Okay? Great.
So if you have further questions, I would urge you to go on and meet Dr. Sinha at his table later. Dr. Sinha, great talk. Thank you so much for all this wonderful information and for helping us put this together.